Welcome. My name is Carlos Lozada. I'm the nonfiction book critic at the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the festival. It is my great pleasure to be here with David Grann. You know him either from his great stories in The New Yorker or books such as Lost City of Z, Killers of the Flower Moon. But we're mainly here to discuss his most recent work, The White Darkness, published last year by Doubleday. A book that grew out of a New Yorker story about a fellow named Henry Worsley, a British Special Forces officer, obsessed with the polar expeditions of Ernest Shackleton and determined to replicate them or surpass them. It's a spare and beautiful book, a lot like the terrain it describes. And the images in it are so riveting that I hope it's no disrespect to an author to say that I couldn't tell if the images accompanied the text or the text accompanied the images. So we'll talk about the book, and as you heard, there'll be time for questions at the end. Remember that if you come up to either microphone, you may be included in videotape of this event, so you'll be immortalized and replayed at some later date. So first off, David, who is Henry Worsley? What drew you to want to tell his story?
Yeah, Henry is one of the most remarkable people I've written about over the years. He was a Special Forces officer, very decorated Army officer. He was also almost a throwback to another age. He was this kind of Renaissance man who wrote poetry, who painted, who sculpted, who was also this adventurer, a collector, and also an amateur historian who became a leading expert on Shackleton. And I had always grown up reading stories about polar explorers, about people like Shackleton who would venture into what is, I think, undoubtedly the most inhospitable environment on Earth. Maybe some people from some other places might disagree, but it is freezing with temperatures that reach below 100 degrees and hurricane-force winds. And so when I came across an article, I think it was in 2015, that this British Army officer, Henry Worsley, who was then 55, planned to do, or attempt to do, what his hero, Ernest Shackleton, had failed to do a century earlier, which was to walk from one side of Antarctica to the other, more than 1,000 miles. And whereas Shackleton had attempted to do it as part of a large expedition, Worsley was going to try to do it alone, and he was going to try to do it without any kind of aids, no food caches planted along the way, no sails or kites or dogs to help propel him along the way. I was immediately intrigued.
And in the book, you chronicle two main expeditions. The one you're talking about was the second. There's one he attempted previously.
Yes. So Worsley was somebody who, from his early ages, he actually had a distant relative who was part of one of Shackleton's expeditions. He had always dreamed of becoming a polar explorer, but how do you become a polar explorer, especially when it's the 1980s and 70s and 90s? It's not something you kind of figure out how to do. And he followed his father and joined the Army. But then in about 2008, he teamed up with two other descendants of a Shackleton expedition. This expedition by Shackleton was known as the Nimrod expedition, and it was Shackleton's attempt to walk to the South Pole, in which he came within 97 miles of the pole before turning back. And Worsley and these two other descendants of that party, one was a direct descendant of Shackleton, and one was a descendant of the second in command on that expedition. One was a kind of pudgy banker, and the other was a kind of scrawny shipping lawyer. They decided to try to reenact this expedition.
Worsley wrote a memoir himself called In Shackleton's Footsteps, and you cite from it a few times. He wrote that he was mesmerized by the hardships that the past explorers endured. What do you think made him mesmerized by suffering?
Yeah. It is a difficult question to answer. When I met Henry Worsley's wife, Joanna, who thinks Antarctica is the most dreadful place on Earth, she asked me the same question: why do you think Henry wanted to do that? And I think there are various forces at work. It's not always one singular one. I think a part of him was kind of chasing the ghost of his father, who had been this kind of revered army officer. And I think Henry wanted some kind of singular achievement of his own. I think he also, like a lot of these polar explorers, there was an inward element to these quests. Shackleton spoke of piercing the veneer of outside things and reaching the naked soul of man. And I think for Worsley on these expeditions, there was almost a monk-like spiritual quality of abnegation. And I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what that entailed, because it's hard to fathom. They would haul all their supplies on sleds behind them. So Henry was pulling a sled of about 320 pounds. You are burning between 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day. You are essentially reduced to little more than a mule, almost a kind of a primitive, almost metronomic. You're just one step after the other. You are caught in whiteouts in which you can't tell what is in front of you or what is behind you. You can become seasick in those whiteouts and fall over because you don't know where to put your foot, because you don't know which way is up or down. And again, you're dealing with temperatures that reach below 100 degrees, minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds that can reach up to 200 miles per hour. So it is an abnegation that is almost unfathomable what they would put them through. Henry would lose between easily more than 40 pounds on his expeditions.
One thing that struck me following on that idea of abnegation, at least in the first expedition you described, after each just incredibly arduous day, Henry would go for a walk at night.
Yeah.
He'd like, his two, fellow explorers were, huddled in the tent trying to keep warm, and he'd go walking, kind of like clear his head, right? And you write that he was like a mystic pursuing enlightenment through self-abnegation. That sounds very elevated. It also sounds insane. Like, what did he learn? I mean, because he kept a diary, right? What were those evening walks? What did they do for him?
He would go about on these walkabouts, and they would sometimes walk up to 12, 13 hours a day through that, and then they would literally collapse into their tents. And you cannot expose yourself. If you get wet, you die. You get into your tent, you start a cooker, you boil the ice to melt it, and Henry's two companions on that first day, they would just collapse, and then Henry would get into the tent and say, "All right, mates, I'm just going to go for a little walkabout." And they're like, and even they, who, were pretty nutty, said, "That's nuts." And he would go for these walks. And I think for him, there was something in that isolation of that landscape, because there are no living creatures, none, once you get to the interior of Antarctica. You don't see a seal, you don't see a bird, there's nothing. There's a little bacteria, apparently, that grows in some places, but that's it, a little germ. And he would comment and he would write in his diary about that sense of feeling, both being intensely aware of his existence, because he could feel every breath, he could feel the cold, he could feel every step, and yet feeling completely alone while looking out into this endless whiteness. And so for him, I think part of this consciousness of both of himself, but of also disappearing within this world, had this spiritual quality. But it's important to understand that on that expedition, Henry and his companions were trying to reenact the Nimrod expedition. So they wanted to reach the point of 97 miles where Shackleton had reached 100 years earlier. They wanted to reach it on that day. And they go through this walk for days and days of suffering and whiteouts. Henry's increasingly weak. And they finally get to this spot. Henry takes out his little GPS and he holds it up. It looked like he was holding like a tea kettle or something. He's walking around like this. And then he hits the coordinates on exactly in the spot that Shackleton had reached. And he takes his pole and he slams it into the ground and he says, "Here, this is the spot." And he and his companions, who have almost sacrificed their lives to attain this grail, to reach this spot, look around them, and what do they see? Absolutely nothing. Their grail was no more than a geographical data point in an endless icescape.
You write that polar expeditions serve as a laboratory for testing human dynamics. What dynamics did Henry Worsley test?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it was one of the reasons that interested me in this project, was that polar explorations and expeditions really are this strange, almost experimental laboratory of human conditions. You're essentially throwing people together for days on end through extreme suffering, extreme deprivation, hunger, frostbite, cold, desolation, and how do you behave? And over history, expeditions have been studied with accounts of parties in which the members had turned upon each other, of backstabbing, sometimes mutinying, even murdering. And so for Worsley, who really looked at Shackleton as his model of how do you manage a party under this kind of duress, he would try to apply those techniques of leading by example when he was with this party. Henry had been in the army, but even when he was in the army, he tried to learn these lessons, which was to eschew kind of standard military hierarchies, to make sure that everybody, no matter what your standing was, participated in the same tasks. You mingled with everybody. You didn't separate yourself from the party. And these were approaches that Shackleton had done, and it's one of the reasons Shackleton has become so revered over time, was for these kind of management techniques that were applied within a party. And Worsley certainly tried to apply it on that first expedition when they were together, when they were, for example, holed up in a whiteout for days. They started a whiskey club. One of them had brought a little bit of whiskey. They played cards. Shackleton had always insisted upon optimism within these conditions, and that was something Worsley really strongly believed in as well.
On his solo expedition, right, when he's trying to cross Antarctica by himself, he gets caught in a storm that breaks one of the poles, I think, of his tent. And I think this was in his diary, he said that this was a salutary reminder of just who is in control around here. Trespassers will be punished. Was he a trespasser? Do we belong there?
Yeah.
By we, I mean people.
Who go? Not me.
We.
We'll just
We
talk
don't
about
belong
it.
there.
Yes. It's interesting. When they reached that 97-mile mark on that first expedition, and I had asked Worsley's companions, about what it was like to reach that spot and just be blanked. He says, what is Antarctica other than a blank space a blank canvas in which you try to impose your will on? And I think for explorers, this cuts to the real rub of your earlier questions. What are you trying to do on these expeditions? There's really nothing there. You are, in a sense, trying to impose your will on the most uninhabitable, unconquerable environment. Henry and his companions were always very respectful of the environment. There are very strict rules about Antarctica. They would clean up their waste They could leave nothing behind. You're not allowed to remove anything. So I don't know if it is a question of whether people belong there, but it is incredibly uninhabitable. And I think Henry's expeditions and the expeditions of Shackleton, and again, this is what drew me to the story, because it's not just about extreme endurance. It really deals with a very deep philosophical question about failure, about can you impose your will upon such a place? At what point do you accept your human frailties? Do you turn back, or do you keep going? And for Worsley on that last expedition, his solo expedition, he reaches a point where he has been going for more than 60 days. He has lost more than 40 pounds. His wife said it was about 60. He is frostbitten in some of his fingers. He has hemorrhoids. His tendons on his Achilles are swollen and bulging. Every part of his body throbs. He has a miserable stomach ache. He is suffering from malnutrition. And yet he has willed himself to within about 100 miles of his goal, to what he referred to as his rendezvous with history. And whenever Worsley was in a situation where he faced peril, he would always ask himself, what would Shackleton do? And in that moment, he faces more peril than he had ever been. And he asked himself that question. And I think on a lesser extent, we all face that question in our lives. Hopefully not in the middle of Antarctica, unless you're a nut. But we all face our private Antarcticas about pushing ourselves and accepting our limitations. And what do we do? And for me, that philosophical question which runs through this story runs through Shackleton's life. It runs through the life of Robert Falcon Scott, another polar explorer who died after reaching the South Pole, which he referred to as the most miserable place on Earth, seeing when he got there his rival Amundsen, a Norwegian flag, realizing he'd been beaten to the pole by 33 days, and then dying on his return with his men. And it is a question that Shackleton faces as well, that Worsley faces as well.
The level of detail in the book is extraordinary about the terrain. I was struck by the varieties of ice.
Yeah.
Especially, I can't remember the name of it, but there is ice that is essentially sculpted into waves by the wind. Yes.
Yeah.
And so the book reads as if you were kind of along with them,
yeah.
right? And you weren't.
No.
So how did you capture that detail? Was it through the diaries? Was it through the images? How did you get the material to tell the story?
Yeah. So I will say that this is the first time where I have written about a subject or somebody, and I did not go to the place. And if you read the story or are familiar with the story, one is my own dislike of the cold, but also when you read the story, you'll kind of understand partly why. And initially, in some ways, the hardest thing for me in writing this story was wrapping myself around the landscape because it's so alien. And when I kind of first sketched out and started writing the article, it was almost like a psychological journey, which just had this kind of white blankness. And I have this wonderful editor, Daniel Zaleski, he said, can you tell us a little bit like what's it physically like? And then I drilled down and tried to kind of understand the Antarctica, and I just would read about the geography, and it was just kind of nuts. Again, it's an area that's about 5.5 million square acres. It's nearly doubles in size in the winter because the water around it freezes. It has the highest elevation of any continent. It is the windiest continent. It is, of course, the coldest continent. But then the fact that really threw me when I really tried to because I just kind of always imagined it snowed, having never been there. And then you realize, no, it's the driest continent as well on Earth.
It's a desert.
It's a desert.
Yeah.
It's a desert. It contains 70% of all the fresh water on Earth. It's more than 90, I think 8% or something like that covered in ice, and yet it's a desert because it's such dry precipitation. And so I had to kind of wrap myself around it. But what was interesting about this project is I felt closer to the subject than any subject I had written about, because he was like a throwback to the Victorian and Edwardian explorers that he worshiped, Worsley. So he meticulously kept diaries, and the family shared those diaries with me even though they had not looked at them before. He made audio recordings in the evenings when he was there in his tent. He would kind of perform this modern magic by calling a friend in London on his satellite phone, who would then record it and post it on his website. So lots of people were following this expedition as it was happening. He took recordings, audio recordings, and as you mentioned, photographs for me really became integral to this story. And to answer your question, I really did see it as both a book of photography and a book of text that were really integrated in a way I hadn't fully done something before. And maybe at some point I did bring some images and we can cue some up and I can try to.
Go ahead.
Should we try to do
it?
Yeah,
they're worth it.
Yeah.
They're so good.
So we'll see if we can pull this off. Yes. So we'll kind of skip around a little bit. That's a picture of Scott pulling somebody out of a crevasse. These crevasses are crazy. They can be just enormous. A whole car could fall through. And it was probably the greatest physical danger, or one of the greatest physical dangers, to Worsley on his solo expedition, because if he fell into a crevasse, there would be nobody to pull him out. That is my favorite photograph, I think, of all time. And I was very happy when somebody who was visiting Bolivia sent me some graffiti of this photograph on a wall that had been painted in graffiti. That is Henry Worsley looking like something out of Mad Max. Now that's from Shackleton, but just gives you some beauty. I'm going to skip a little bit around. Here is Shackleton. This is a picture of Henry Worsley's relative, descendant, who was part of Shackleton's famous endurance expedition. And that's a picture of Henry in the army. That was a picture with him with Scott. Oh gosh, this is always, I think that, it's hard for me to see, but that is always to me the saddest photograph, because that's the South Pole when Scott got there and saw the Norwegian flag. I'm going to skip past some of Shackleton's expedition a little bit here from his endurance, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to get to some of the pictures. This is the picture from Henry's first expedition, and these are the two other descendants from Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, setting out at the beginning of their journey. That is one of the members of the expedition's descendant, Boyd, who was the second in command on the Nimrod expedition. This is Henry Worsley and Gow training for that expedition, dragging tires across a field. This is them in Greenland, further training for their first expedition. And soon, this shows you a little bit of the route and gives you a little bit of a sense of where they went. And now we're going to start to get to some of these kind of remarkable pictures. One of the things they had to do on that expedition to reach the South Pole was to cross the Transantarctic Mountains, which divide the continent. And it's almost impossible to get across. Shackleton, on his expedition, found one of the only or few passable places, which is this glacier. But the glacier, which looks like a frozen highway, is utterly perilous and just pocked with crevasses. This is them arriving for that expedition on the Ross Ice Shelf. The Ross Ice Shelf is where these expeditions began, and it is the largest frozen body of sea ice in the world. It is about the size of France. They would have to cross that on the beginning of the expedition. This is kind of a crazy photograph.
It's a great moment.
Yeah, it's just a crazy moment. So when Henry and his companions are on their first expedition, they land, they kind of go on to Ross Island, and they see in the shallow part of the island this little hut. And they knew instantly what it is, and they rush into it, and it was the hut that Shackleton had built during his Nimrod expedition, where they had stayed before they set out. And so Gow, who was the great-grandson of his ancestor, he found the bed where he had slept in that hut. And of course, Worsley felt like he could never get any closer to his mentor. The only thing left to do was to walk to the South Pole. And here you can see them walking across that sea ice. Again, these photographs are part of that question that Carlos asked of how did I kind of wrap my brain and describe the area. Their documentation of it is kind of mesmerizing. There you could just see those small little sleds in that awesome landscape. This is a picture from outside their tent.
That's the ice.
That's the ice.
I love the
This is what is called sastrugi. There are so many different forms of ice, and you become an expert on the ice. Henry became an expert on the ice. There's blue ice. There's they called it the soft ice. There's the sludgy ice. There's the powdery ice, and then there is the sastrugi. And what the sastrugi is that it's so cold, and the wind sculpts the ice, and it freezes. And for literally, I don't know, tens of hundreds of miles, all you see is this ocean. It literally looks like an ocean of waves, and it's hard ice. It's actually really hard to get over. You have to and they each will come up with their own tactic. Do you tack it up, or do you kind of sidestep over it? In any case, that gives you a little bit of a sense, I hope. This is, I don't know if they could put volume on it, but this is the wind blowing. They took a little video of it. So in any case, that gives you a little bit of sense, I think.
Now, the images in the book are tremendous. The last question I want to ask you before we open it up to audience questions. You write early on in the book that heroes are a reflection of the societies that venerate them. Is Henry Worsley a hero for our time? Should he be?
It's a great question. So, not to go too far back in history before I answer your question, because it gets to the nub of Shackleton. Shackleton was interesting. Shackleton was in many ways a failure. He made several attempts, and they all failed. He tried to reach the South Pole twice. Both times he failed. And then he tried to walk across Antarctica with his famous endurance expedition, and the ship got frozen in ice, and they kind of lived on the ship trapped in the ice. Those were those earlier photographs, which I kind of went through. And eventually the boat sinks in the ice, and they're on an ice floe floating about 800 miles from the nearest place of contact with any civilization. And somehow, through his leadership abilities, he manages to get everybody back there alive. And after Shackleton died, he was he was not as famous as the way he was today. In many ways, he was kind of forgotten. And Scott, who had reached the South Pole but died, in the kind of context of World War I and the context of the fading British Empire, he became the icon. Scott had written in his diary, "Before his men die, we shall die like gentlemen." And he was seen as somebody who had kind of sacrificed his life for his country. And it was only in the modern age, really by the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, that people began to turn their attention to Shackleton as we kind of entered into an age of management, an age of organization, in which how you manage people with large organizations, an age of strategy, that Scott was suddenly seen as imperious and kind of fumbling and in many ways denigrated, and Shackleton became elevated. And so that is a perfect example of how heroes are, in many ways, as much a reflection of our times as they are of their own deeds. Even talk about the statue debate. should Worsley be here? You know, it's funny, as a writer, I don't tend to think in those terms because it would reduce me. It would cause me to be reductive, I think, in the way I portrayed them. I just want to understand them as best I can with their foibles, with their admirable qualities. I mean, Henry had courage, he had determination. I love the fact that he was this kind of Renaissance figure, that he was kind of this, you know, this military figure who sewed and went into prisons to teach sewing. I just thought, well, this is just kind of a wonderful, and his family are remarkable. In some ways, I found his wife as much a hero in some ways. So I don't think always in those terms. I kind of like people who read the book, hopefully, to try to wrestle with it. But I would say this, which is, Henry would not have wanted to be remembered as Scott was. He would have wanted to be remembered in the light of Shackleton. And so there's a paradox there in how we remember Henry. I'm not giving too much away, but many of you may know.
Yeah, no, it's the kind of book that you will sort of read it in one sitting. But no, I think we've managed to not give too much away about the final expedition. Are there questions for David? We have 2 microphones here. Whoever wants to come forward. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Hi. Go ahead.
Oh, I just was interested if you would talk about the influence of Alfred Lansing's book on your research and investigation.
Yeah, it's such a great book. So Alfred Lansing wrote the book Endurance, and it was the first kind of re-examination of Shackleton and focused on that endurance expedition where the boat was frozen in the ice and then sank, and how they got back. And that book is a really interesting story, too, that gets at the question of how we remember people. He wrote that book, and he worked really hard on it, and then it came out, and it essentially disappeared. It wasn't read. And then he died, and as Shackleton was kind of being rediscovered, people rediscovered the book, and it's now considered truly a masterpiece, one of the great books of exploration, expedition. And so it had a real influence on me because that expedition in particular, I couldn't understand Worsley without understanding Shackleton. And so, because Worsley had modeled his life on Shackleton in so many ways. I mean, he was an obsessive collector of everything Shackleton. His wife said we lost a fortune on Shackletonian. And one of my favorite anecdotes is in the story is Henry slips off to an auction house. I think it was Sotheby's, I don't remember. And he wanted to buy, I don't even remember which book it was now, but it was like an first edition of a book that Shackleton had written, and he had inscribed it to his parents. And Worsley keeps bidding on it, but there's an anonymous bidder on the phone. And each time he bids something higher, the anonymous bidder on the phone beats him out. And then he realizes that it was only later that it was his wife trying to get him an anniversary present.
Like the weirdest gift of the Magi.
Yeah, the gift of the Magi. So yes, but he didn't know. But in any case, that book was very helpful to me in trying to understand Shackleton. I think it's a wonderful book.
Thanks. Kind of like a meta question. This isn't your first book about explorers, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of this versus Lost City of Z, and like your writing as a broader project. Is this subject something that you're kind of continually returning to in different ways? How do you kind of approach this topic more broadly?
Yeah. So my first book was called The Lost City of Z, and it was about a British explorer from the same period of Shackleton who had mapped a lot of the Amazon and then set out with his oldest son to try to find an ancient settlement, which he referred to as the City of Z or the City of Z, and then disappeared kind of leaving behind one of the great exploration mysteries about what had happened to them and did this ancient settlement exist. It was interesting in that book because the British explorer was a man named Fawcett, and he, on one of his expeditions, he goes with somebody who had been on an early Shackleton expedition. And there are these two kind of titanic egos, and they both think that their form of environment was harder than the other. And then they set off, and one of this poor man, Murray, who goes his body gets taken over by maggots, and then Fawcett was kind of maniacal, and he made everyone who agreed to come with him to accept the prospect of being abandoned because there wouldn't be a way to carry them out, and this poor man was essentially abandoned. And the forms and the environments could not be different. The Amazon is a realm of overstimulation. It is an environment of biodiversity in an abundance that is unfathomable, that is bewildering, and that is overwhelming of the senses. There are snakes, there are insects. Everywhere you turn, there's something, a different kind of plant. And the Antarctica is, how do you survive in an environment of complete desolation, complete deprivation of your senses? Could not be polar extent. So the environments are very different, but I suppose there is something in the journeys of searching, of questing, that intrigues me, that interests me. They have inherent narratives. They often tap into myths that we kind of grew up reading, or from Odysseus or whatnot. And I suppose as a reporter and a writer, they often make great stories, but there is a questing in writing and researching. We are all, as writers, searching in some ways for our city of Zed that are always, in my mind, elusive, that we never quite reach. But I also think, for me, they also kind of tap into this question of, and what do we kind of do with ourselves in this short span of life on Earth? And I find it really interesting and gravitate toward people who kind of address that question in unusual ways. I don't always agree with them, but I find it fascinating.
David, it's a real pleasure to hear you speak. I've read your books and I love them. You answered my question in large measure, but a couple years ago, David McCullough was asked a question of how does he pick his topics? And he says, I want to learn about them. Do you have clippings or things you think might be an article or things you think, well, that would be a book? Because Killers of the Flower Moon is completely different from what these two are. So could you speak to that?
Yeah.
Maybe what's next?
Yeah. So, partly I am a generalist by nature, and I almost, even though I've done now a couple, at least two kind of expedition stories, I really never want to replicate. I'm somebody who actually, whatever I did last, I kind of want to do something totally different. And I am always searching for ideas. To me, I think, and I know Carlos could probably talk about this too, but it's the hardest thing, I think, finding the right thing, the right book, whatever it is to write about, what kind of grabs you. And so I'm always tearing out bits of articles. I find the sad part of the kind of disappearance of metropolitan newspapers, but one of my great secrets for many years was reading metropolitan newspapers.
Obituaries.
Yeah, nothing better. Still, I'm an obituary nut.
Yeah.
And looking at the briefs, the little 100-word stories, the little thing, and you find some weird combination of words that just kind of perk your interest. I rember reading one that said, members of a prison gang known as the Aryan Brotherhood had been arrested while in prison. I just thought, arrested while in prison? How the hell do you get arrested in prison? And then I thought, how does a gang even operate? We know they exist. And so it just kind of led to these questions that want to be answered. For Killers of the Flower Moon, I had, which is about the Osage Nation, members of the Osage Nation, in Oklahoma, who in the early 20th century had become the wealthiest people per capita in the world because of oil deposits under their land. They were millionaires, they lived in mansions, and then they began to be serially murdered for their oil money, and it became one of the FBI's first major homicide cases. I had made a trip out to the Osage Nation, and I had visited the museum there. and I had seen this huge photograph on the wall. And actually, kind of the photographs in that book led me to the photographs in this book in some ways. But I saw this huge photograph on the wall that was taken in 1924, and it looked really innocent. And it showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers. But I noticed that a portion of that photograph had been cut out. And I had asked the museum director, who has since become a really good friend of mine, but I was meeting for the first time, Catherine Redford, I said, what happened to that? And she said it contained a figure so frightening she had decided to remove it. And then she pointed to the missing panel and she said the devil was standing right there. And she went down into the basement and brought up an image of the missing panel, and it contained one of the killers of the Osage. And it's very rare that a story has such an origin story that's so kind of neat, but it really did, because I kept thinking about, and it's a little bit like what McCullough said, I kept thinking about that image because the Osage had removed it because they couldn't forget that history. It was so painful. And yet people like me and so many other people had never been taught it or never learned it. We had essentially excised it from our conscience. And I kind of embarked on that project, which took 5 years to address my own ignorance. And so I think to some degree, you are always answering questions you don't know the answer to.
We're out of time. David, thank you so much for a
Thank you
wonderful
all. Thank you for
conversation.
coming. Thank you, Carlos.